Hello and welcome to Health Psychology. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 1, which introduces us to the field of health psychology. Health psychology is the branch of psychology that concerns individual behaviors and lifestyles affecting a person's physical health. In essence, health psychology looks at how we can be healthy and concerns itself with a number of different topics in health. Health psychology looks at how we can prevent disease, behaviors, and things that we can engage in on the individual level as well as the societal level in order to stay healthy. Health psychology is especially concerned with preventing chronic diseases, which are things like cancer and diabetes. Health psychology doesn't just help us prevent disease, however, it also looks a lot at enhancing health. So in essence, how can we function optimally? Things like exercise and eating healthy to promote healthful functioning, as well as the psychological states and other things that might help us lead to maximal health. Health psychology also looks at public opinion and the messages that are put out through different avenues to manage health perspectives on a societal level. Lastly, health psychology looks at the healthcare system, how we receive healthcare, how we distribute medical care, and the way we can best do this. The field of health has changed drastically over the past century. In the 1900s, lifespan was approximately 50 years of age. At this time, when people did die, they mainly died from infectious diseases. These were caused by pathogens that people would receive from the environment that would make them sick. For example, people might pass diseases from one to the other, right? Things like pneumonia, tuberculosis, infections that we'd get from sick people that would cause death. People would also get sick from drinking contaminated water and eating food, things like that. When people did contract these infections at this time, there were very few cures that medicine had to offer. So these diseases often led to death, sometimes premature death. Currently, we've made huge strides in healthcare, really cut down on the deaths from these infectious diseases. Things like vaccines, our medical care. So these infections aren't killing people anymore. Today, instead, we see that people are really dying from chronic diseases. Chronic diseases are diseases that develop and persist or reoccur over a long period of time. A lot of these chronic diseases are affected by our lifestyle factors. So when we were dying from infectious diseases, these are passed from person to person, maybe in the food you ate, just the air you breathe, right? We have a lot of problem preventing these diseases. With chronic diseases, they're a little more insidious, right? So things like how we eat, how we move, what behaviors we engage in on a day-to-day basis affect the course and the outcomes of these chronic diseases. So this is one of the ways that health psychology is going to come in and really make an impact on our health. Right? This is where the psychology comes into play. Our behavior really does have an impact on whether we get these chronic diseases and their outcomes. So as we can see in 1900, right, these leading causes of death got pneumonia, tuberculosis, right, diarrhea, all these things that could be passed from person to person, caused by pathogens from the environment. Heart disease, only 6.2% of deaths in 1900, and then cancer is down here at 3.7%. Right, so these chronic diseases were much less prevalent. Now we can see modern day, right, these are statistics from 2009, heart disease and cancer, our chronic diseases, have become our leading factors, right? The two most common reasons that people die. So what are some factors that contribute to disease patterns and death? First off, we have age. Probably the most obvious thing associated with age is that older people die at a higher rate than younger people, right? With increased age comes increased risk of death. However, we also see that there's different patterns in terms of disease and death, things that affect people in different age brackets. So for individuals under the age of 44, unintentional injuries are actually the main killer. So while heart disease and cancer are the biggest factors overall, if you're under the age of 44, your actual biggest risk is some type of unintentional injury, maybe a car crash, falling down the stairs, things like that. This is followed by suicide and homicide. So our younger groups are actually more likely to die from these violent accidents, things like that. For adults over the age of 45, however, the picture is very different. Cardiovascular disease and cancer become our most likely killers, and unintentional injury drops to third. Because older people die at a higher rate than younger people, right? When we look at our overall deaths, most of these are coming from this 45 plus bracket. When we look at our statistics for our population as a whole, heart disease and cancer are our main killers, right? Accounting for 60% of all deaths. So when we look at the picture like that, it looks like everyone's more likely to die of heart disease and cancer, but we actually know that if you're under 45, you're more at risk for dying in some type of accident. Next, we have ethnicity and income. We see that different patterns of diseases affect different ethnic groups at different rates. So heart disease and cancer are number 1 and 2 for every single group, right? All of our different populations in the United States are at risk for heart disease and cancer. However, things like Alzheimer's disease are in the top 10 for European Americans and Asian Americans, but not for African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our African Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to die from homicide and chronic liver disease. So we see that different ethnic groups are at risk of different things. These risks are likely tied to patterns of income and poverty. We see that in the United States, about 10% of European Americans live below the poverty line, whereas 32% of African Americans and 26% of Hispanic Americans live below the poverty line. Individuals who live in these situations are at greater risk for a number of reasons. There's stresses associated with overcrowding, having problems with finding safe, clean housing. They also have harder time accessing medical care, right? So things like health insurance, accessing good prenatal care. When mothers don't get the prenatal care that they need, we see low birth weight in babies, which leads to higher infant mortality. We see that association between income level and health is very strong, and this isn't just at the poverty level. So we don't just see that people who live below the poverty line don't have access to health insurance and health care that helps them combat the diseases that they get. But even at the higher income brackets, there's still this relationship between wealth and health. So in other words, people who are very rich have better health than people who are just rich, right? This increase in money increases my likelihood of good health across the spectrum. Lastly, we see that education is a big factor for health. People who graduate high school have lower death rates than those who do not, but people who graduate from college, we see even more protection. So people who attend college show a death rate of less than half than high school graduates in their age bracket, right? So those who go to college, they really lower their risk of death from all causes, right? So what are some protective factors of going to college? Might be a little bit intelligence, which does predict health and longevity, but the biggest impact is likely that these well-educated people probably have access to a large amount of health-related knowledge, right? So as you all know, in college, going to college teaches you how to find sources, right? You can access health information. It teaches you how to screen these sources, right? How to get on the internet and tell what is a good source of health-related information versus what might not be as well. They also have likely higher income, which as we've seen is a big predictor for health, and tend to have good access to healthcare. They also have lower health-related problematic behaviors, so things like smoking, using drugs, these tend to be lower in our college-educated population. So because of this whole myriad of circumstances surrounding people who go to college, there's a huge protective factor, and this population really is better off in terms of health long-term. One of the biggest factors that's going to impact our overall life expectancy, however, is infant mortality. So when we look at that increase from 50 to 80, right, in 1900s, life expectancy was 50 years. Now it's closer to 80. One of the biggest factor that's going to affect that is infant mortality. So we've seen a huge decline during this time period in the number of babies we see dying shortly after birth. So when we look at our whole population and we're calculating our average, we have a bunch of zeros, right? A bunch of babies that only lived a few hours, few months. This is going to drastically drop our life expectancy, right? These numbers in our average. So now we see that as we have decreased our infant mortality, our life expectancy goes up. So what is health? What is health today, right? Health psychology, we want to get in, we want to do the research, figure out how to make people healthy, but what does that mean? Previously, right, our kind of more traditional view of health would have been the biological model, which is going to define health as the absence of disease. Okay. We can see back in the 1900s, when we were dying of infectious diseases, this is pretty straightforward, right? Do you have tuberculosis? Do you have the chicken pox, right? These things that we were infected by, is the pathogen present? When it's present, you're sick. Do you recover, get better, now you're healthy, or die, right? So someone with tuberculosis is sick. Someone without is healthy, right? That's pretty clear cut. Is the pathogen there or not? That kind of doesn't really work with our current situation, however, right? Now that we're dying of things like diabetes and heart disease, do we have heart disease or do we not? Well, we kind of have more of a spectrum, right? Are we at risk of diabetes? Are we pre-diabetic? Are we engaging in behaviors that put us at a high risk of diabetes? Do we have obesity, right? It's not just this clear cut, you're diabetic or you're not, right? We look at the whole functioning and the whole person to determine whether or not we have this condition and also whether or not we're at risk of this condition. So the current model that is used that better fits what we do today is the biopsychosocial model. This model holds that many diseases result from a combination of factors, such as genetics, physiology, social support, personal control, stress, compliance, personality, poverty, ethnic background, and cultural beliefs, right? So when we look at how our bodies function and whether or not we have these diseases, not only did these diseases fall on a spectrum, but the causes are very diverse, right? What causes type 2 diabetes in one person might be different from the other. Same with heart disease. There's all these different lifestyle factors. Our behaviors, our personality, our diet. We've also got our biology, right? So our genetics, our gender, our age, our vulnerability, right? If your parent had a condition, you're more at risk for this condition, as well as our social situation, right? So things like poverty, right? Ethnic background, cultural background, the stresses we face, things like racism, right? Just our environment. Is our environment conducive to our health behaviors, or is it not? So now that we have this biopsychosocial model, and we see that this better correlates, right? Better lines up with the diseases that we're seeing today, this is really where health psychology can come in and help us out, right? So we look at all these factors and then define health on more of a spectrum, right? With tuberculosis, it's clear cut. Yes or no, right? 0 or 1. When we look at our current health situations, a lot more gray area, right? Are we healthy? Are we at this far end of the spectrum where I'm not really having any problems? I'm not really engaging in any problematic behaviors? No symptoms, no conditions, no risk or very low risk? Or are we kind of on the disease spectrum, right? Where I have these problems and I have a lot of health things going on? Then we can also be in the middle here where we're somewhere between. So now that we look at it this way, we have this health psychology field come in, right? We need that psychology aspect of health. We need to look at the myriad of causes, the myriad of factors, and see how they come into play and how we can work at our health from a variety of different areas to kind of come together and increase health for our population in general. You'll see over the course of this semester how health psychology works and how the biopsychosocial model will come into play.